Hello there, welcome back to the show, World War II Books Where to Start. I'm your host, Henry Kaiser, and I like to build big ships. And big ships is how we're going to win this war, because we got to defeat the U-boats before we do anything else. And the Pacific, well, it's way over there. So today we're going to address that question of how and why and what led to the victory for the Allies in World War II. Now, China is excluded here. China never gets on the page for any reason in any of the books I'm going to address today. They don't count. The Italians usually don't count. And in one of them, the Soviets don't matter at all either. You may be wondering, what the hell am I talking about here? That's because when you address ways and means, you're always talking about production and economic capacity. And in the first book, we're talking about why more than how, sort of. Okay, let's go. First up, Richard Overy's Why the Allies Won, from 95 or 97, somewhere in that slot. That's a different cover than I had when I originally bought this. I read it and got rid of it because I was so ticked off at it when I got finished with it. I just chucked it at the door, and I've been pretty much anti-Richard Overy ever since. But I reread this as a companion after another book I'm going to discuss to see if it's still that bad. And the answer is, for the most part, yes. So the first chunk of the book is taken up with a bare bones recitation of the war's events up to, let's say, about the midpoint or end of 42. I mean, just everything that happens, just in sequence, without explanation why. And it took me a while to figure out why. Because up until the end of 42, or mid-42, all we were doing was losing. And after that, all we were doing was winning. So he wants to just cut off the bad part of the war, get that out of the way. We won't discuss why we were losing. We'll only discuss why we won. Whatever. But it's just a chunk of the book taking up space for no reason. You could just chop that out and say, I'm going to skip here and give you reasons why, and it'd be perfectly valid. There's no need for recitation of war's events. I guarantee you no newbie is walking into a bookstore and going to pick this one up. Absolutely not. Know your audience. That's pretty basic. But at any rate, so once we get into it, what's wrong with it? Well, he's got the wrong stats for just about everything. And this is really annoying. If you're a world-renowned World War II author, you ought to be able to get basic stats right. Wrong number of pilots, Japanese pilots killed at Midway. Wrong torpedo loadout for a Type 7 sub. Wrong number of crew members for a T-34. He says 2. Are you kidding me? No, he apparently isn't kidding. But, I mean, what a joke. Background to the founding of Stalingrad, the city of. Why? Who cares? Little thing about the sword of Stalingrad presented to the Soviets. Why? Who cares? It's got nothing to do with why the Allies won. U-977 and U-530 that famously went to Argentina after the war are mentioned. 2 or 3 paragraphs. Why? This has got nothing to do with nothing of the whys and hows and wherefores. So it's a real hodgepodge of what the hell are we talking about and why are we talking about it. And interspersed with occasionally good chapters here and there. He does address leadership for the Allies and somewhat for the Soviets and a little bit of the Germans. And this could have been a much better aspect to explore deeply. He does better, obviously, with the Allies, focusing on the Brits and the Americans. He could have done so much more here. But at least we get that. The Soviets are passed off lightly, but they're covered, just a few of them. And the Germans, again, you've got acres and acres to run with here about their deficient command system. I just don't get why you didn't just go hog wild on this. But he didn't. The Italians are mentioned briefly. The Japanese don't matter. It doesn't cover them. Maybe he doesn't know Japanese politics, but I suspect it's more that British prejudice towards the ETO, where the PTO just, you talk about Singapore and the Prince of Wales, that matters. Burma, everything else, completely, it doesn't matter. So it's bare bones in a lot of respects. The bombing war is covered pretty well. The effects of strategic bombing, the disappointments with it early on, and its lack of clarity and target destruction or target focus, and what will bring Germany to its knees, and do we really believe the airmen that we don't need infantry for this, we can do it all by ourselves, and strategic bombing's evolution during the war to just pure destruction by the end. We're making the rubble bounce because that's all we got left to hit, but we keep doing it because they won't surrender. And and that's probably the best aspect of the book. But there's not a whole lot to hang on to here. The why the Allies won is kind of addressed in a sloppy closing chapter that kind of weakly waves the flag and kind of smell the parade going by, sort of. But it's not convincing in any stretch of the imagination. While he alludes to the lack of moral clarity for the Allies and how they pursued the war, and a bit of naughty for strategic bombing, at the end, when you're trying to wrap this thing up, he doesn't give us any better clarity of exactly why the Allies won. He only addresses production in a side quest kind of thing, and it's not a deep focus. And I don't know how you can ignore economics and economic power when you're talking about battlefield victories in a war of attrition, and yet he does. So while I despise this in the 90s, I still pretty much hate it now, and that's going to be a 1 to 1.5 stars. That is Richard Overy's grand attempt, Why the Allies Won. All right, next up is Paul Kennedy from 2022, Victory at Sea, with a really large subtitle here, Naval Power and the Transformation of the Global Order in World War II, blah, blah, blah. That's a whopping subtitle. So this is ponderous and ponderous. I only went into this because I have a fond memory of The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which I read in college way back when. And his section on World War II then was all about economics and how economics determine a war of attrition, full stop. He was all on board with the U.S. and Great Britain and Soviets being the biggest three economic powerhouses in the world, could not possibly have failed to win the war. He was all on board with that, and that's around about 1985-ish. After that, he wrote something, which I think, do I have it around here? Yeah, Engineers of Victory, which I read a while ago. And this was garbage. 5 key inventions and how they contributed to the Allied victory. He's not a technical writer, and he doesn't really get it. He really doesn't get it. Didn't convince me in the slightest. Especially when you're talking about Hobart's Follies being a key and vital and necessary, and if we didn't have it, we couldn't have carried D-Day. No, stop it. So this is going to be a recitation, general history of naval events in the war. Maybe not all of them, especially in the Pacific. He kind of hops, skips, and jumps because he's a British historian, and the PTO only matters when he says it does. Whew, boy, but the upside of that is Pearl Harbor doesn't get belabored, and Midway is dispensed with in about a paragraph and a half. Although there's a curious mention of seagulls at Midway, I'm not kidding. And if you want to chase that one, I think it's an eye roller for everybody. So he's really intent on control of the seas and sea denial as being a key component of victory for the Allies. Who controls the sea controls the war. Okay, we get it. That's not a radical concept. He's going to pound every nail and lock down every bolt on this. And while the Norway stuff is pretty good, and the Mediterranean stuff is pretty good, because I'm not as familiar with the Mediterranean theater, so while it's nothing startling and new, but it's at least thorough and insightful, sort of. Although he overvalues the Italian fleet, something tremendous. He's really addicted to how pretty their ships looked and how well designed they were, without considering that when they did get caught in a sea fight, they either got pounded, like at Matapan, or they ran away, like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So the overvalue of the Italian ships is kind of confusing. But it's one of the highlights, better parts of the book. And then there's the dreaded Battle of the Atlantic. And it's amazing, and I know I'll harp on this, but I'm going to do it again. 80 years after the war, British historians in particular are still gaining the wrong lessons from statistical analysis of the U-boat war. They just refuse to see the forest for the trees or the trees for the forest. They just will not understand that statistical analysis has proven over and over again that the Allies were never in danger of having their sea communications cut across the Atlantic. The U-boats just couldn't do it. They were outdated platforms from the get-go. They just had the initial jump on the Brits because of the surprise effect of declaring war. They had the initial, ha ha ha, we're going to get you. But once the Brits caught up to them, and then the Americans joined in with the technological advantage, forget it. They were never going to win. But he refuses to back down on this and repeats the old saw about HX 229 SC 122 being the critical convoy battle in 43 and how it reflected the danger of sea communications being cut off and the possibility of surrender to Germany. It's just unbelievably bad to keep doing this in year 2025 or 22 when he wrote this, reading here in 25. It's just unbelievably egregiously bad. So this is a long slog. If you've never had it or never read a general history of the war, the battle, the war at sea in World War II, I would still recommend Craig Simon's general history over this any day of the week, at any hour of the day. But if you can't find Craig Simon's, this is a poor man's substitute for it. That's Victory at Sea by Paul Kennedy. All right, then our third entry today is How the War Was Won by Phillips, Payson, O'Brien. This is from 2015, and it's pretty massive. It's going to clock in around about 500-ish, main body at 500. So he's a Scottish scholar. And this is kind of important to mention because it kind of offsets the British biases in World War II writing to some degree. And he doesn't like winning. You might imagine that's pretty standard if you're not actually British, but you're in the UK, whatever, that you would kind of take a disparaging view of winning. I'm not surprised by that at all. In the intro, you mentioned something kind of interesting to me, that the Japanese aircraft industry was actually much higher productivity than I had thought it was. And that, he says, up until about 43, they kept pace with both Soviet and German production in relative numbers in their aircraft industry. That kind of was mind-boggling to me. I never realized that. And it kind of makes me wonder because back in Shattered Sword, Parshall and Tully mentioned that Japanese are actually scraping for aircraft to fulfill out their complements for the carriers going into Midway, because they're only churning out like 10 to 15 zeros a month or something at the time. And with their commitments all over the Pacific Basin, they're having enough trouble replacing the losses from Coral Sea. So that kind of contradicts that. I don't know, maybe it was a temporary glitch in the production lineup, I'm not sure. But interesting that the Japanese aircraft industry was actually pretty top-notch for a few years. He ditches Russia like a bad habit. Just they're not important. Italy too. Off with your head. They don't matter. He says some really crazy stuff like the Russian Air Force and its immense size, especially from 43 onwards, was irrelevant to their victory. Which, wow, he just dismisses them out of hand with that grandiose statement. Yeah, they had a lot of stuff, but their Air Force didn't matter. Interesting assessment. Just a quick note on the cover art. This is from the University Press. So we get the weird University Press artwork, cover art. Now, there are a couple different iterations of this, of course. It's already been reprinted a few times. But I can't help wondering how in the hell this was selected. We got a picture or a painting of the Shoho taking a pounding at Coral Sea. This was a painting done at wartime, and this has nothing to do with how the war was won. The loss of the Shoho at Coral Sea is not emblematic of anything in the war as far as winners and losers. Wouldn't you have a picture of Rosie the Riveter or her gang of Rosie Riveters put together B-17, or wouldn't you have a picture of the Willow Run plant with B-24 stretching into infinity, rolling off the production line, or wouldn't you have a picture of my shipyards turning out Liberty ships by the dozen on a monthly basis? I don't understand the choice of cover art here. It's just mysterious. The photos section, the photos interspersed throughout the book are largely insets. A couple full pages. Very curious way they did this. And there's a couple mostly stock photos, but a couple odd ones. again, but not focusing on production, which is the theme of the book. Production wins the day, period, in a battle of attrition, and getting those armaments to the battlefield, which is what the Allies did, and the Germans eventually couldn't, and the Japanese definitely couldn't. And that's kind of a big focus here. He's got 3 stages of interdicting and destroying enemy equipment: A, at the source, i.e. the factory; B, in transit to the battlefield; and C, on the battlefield. And of those, he rates C, the battlefield, the least important. He kind of says that battlefield attrition, all in all, didn't really matter because you could easily replace the vehicles lost and the rifles lost, and the ammunition could be reproduced. Given the size of these economies fighting each other in relative matters, you're not, until late in the war, until after the Normandy campaign, when the effect of interdicting at the source of production kind of means they're not getting anything at the battlefield, then the battlefield losses do matter. And it's kind of an interesting aspect. Maybe not. I think sometimes that's more tactical than strategic. Like if you destroy, 25 Japanese tanks on Guadalcanal, that does matter because they're not getting any more in. That battlefield point of attrition really matters right then, and that's in 42, 43. So I don't know. It's kind of a weird way to look at things, but he's got a lot of odd, skewed, and out of the ordinary things to say here. And while there's a dense amount of repetition because of what he's talking about, production, economic factors, weaving back and forth through the course of the war, you're going to get a lot of repetition. But I was all in on it. This straddles the thin line between scholarly work and popular history. So it's not for everyone in that respect. It's pretty dense. And some of the arguments you have to go back and forth and read them again, like, did he really make sense there? And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so generally for European theater, he is not involved in tactics or strategy. And he sometimes says that casualties don't matter, which is interesting. Losing and taking ground is kind of irrelevant. And he kind of blows off the Soviet war effort almost entirely, kind of pointing out that what a lot of other authors have said about the deindustrialization of the war in the East, where it kind of, for the Germans, bogs down in a horse and cart and dragging artillery pieces around by hand, and they're still able to hold off the Russians for 2 years, versus the Soviets' plethora of equipment, courtesy of their factories and Lend-Lease, and just still throwing masses of men. While they did get better at their attacks, obviously, Germans were held to overcomes. So he just kind of blows off the Eastern Front as being a slugfest that really doesn't matter to the war. It's kind of an interesting conclusion that no author would reach. And take it or leave it, take it for what it's worth. I don't know how to take it. It's just bizarre. I don't think I've ever seen that before. Conclusion about the air war. He dives into the ethics of it in the last year of the war in the Pacific. And he comes down on the side of dropping the atomic bombs was prudent or necessary to end the war, versus the slow blockade option, which would have killed more Japanese civilians in the long run, etc., etc. What else? Oh, he does seem to think the Type 21 sub would have made a difference. So he's not up to snuff on his submarine war stuff. Not at all. Type 21s were deeply flawed. They're pretty much a prototype and needed to be redesigned entirely before they'd be effective combat vehicles, but he's just not into that. So while he does cover the stats of production, and graphs and charts are all throughout the book, he's a spreadsheet guy, a lot of that's really good and very interesting, but sometimes his itty-bitty conclusions of particular parts of the war kind of leave you mind-boggled. But of the 3 I've covered today, this is easily the best, and How the War Was Won by Phillips, Payson, and O'Brien. So I hope one of these 3 might pique your interest somehow, some way. And until next time, I am Henry Kaiser. After the war, I think I want to retire to the Caribbean and enjoy my ill-gotten gains. Until next time, happy reading.